Welcome. My name is Kris Billhardt. I'm the Technical Assistant Specialist for the National Alliance for Safe Housing, a project of the District Alliance for Safe Housing, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. Thanks for joining us and welcome to this webinar session titled Housing First and Rapid Rehousing for Survivors, Creating and Supporting Safe and Stable Housing for Survivors of Domestic and Sexual Violence. I want to welcome my esteemed colleague and co-presenter, Linda Olsen, Housing Project Director for the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We'll be trading off the mic as we move through the presentation, and I will go ahead and get us started. So first, a little bit more about NASH, the National Alliance for Safe Housing. We are a project, as I said, of the District Alliance for Safe Housing in Washington, D.C., which is a local, innovative safe housing program. We've been a national technical assistance and training provider since October of 2015. And our project partners include the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the D.C. Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we are also, NASH is also part of the Federal Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, which is a bulky acronym, DVH-TAC, so we also call ourselves the consortium. And NASH's purpose is to really work with programs and communities around the country who are working at the intersection between domestic and sexual violence and homelessness and housing instability. And we aim to provide tools and strategies and technical assistance so that they can help survivors and their children ultimately avoid homelessness as the only way that they can live free from abuse. This is a great website that has been produced by the consortium, the Safe Housing Partnerships website, and it's chock full of information that we've collected in one place that can really help you look at strategies for building partnerships, more data about effective services, and some of the key approaches to working with survivors around preventing housing instability. So that's a great source to check out. So moving to today's learning objectives, we hope to just spend a little bit of time to help folks be on the same page about understanding the basics of the Housing First approach. We're going to also look at new approaches, maybe innovations in some communities that can support safe and stable housing for survivors. We're also going to be spending some time looking at the rapid rehousing approach to housing stabilization. And that model requires some modifications when it's being used with survivors in order to boost its effectiveness. So we'll look at some of those. And then we're also going to be highlighting a successful statewide effort, otherwise known as WSCDV, the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, that has really been making great gains in their state to increase safe housing options for survivors in all kinds of communities, rural, urban, and tribal. So today's agenda, first we'll look at why focus on housing for survivors. Why are we really wanting that to be part of what we consider, within the realm of necessary advocacy for survivors of domestic and sexual violence? We'll also be exploring the Housing First philosophy and what that's all about, and then how it applies to working with survivors' housing needs. We'll look at domestic violence housing first, so service delivery approaches for survivors specifically within a housing first context, applying a rapid rehousing approach with survivors and the necessary adaptations for that, and then exploring housing first in action in Washington State. So in terms of why housing really needs to be part of our advocacy around in our work for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, I love this quote, which was from a participant in a program that I used to manage here in Portland, Oregon. She said, housing made everything else possible. And that, in a nutshell, describes a lot of what we'll be talking about today. housing as a foundation was really necessary for this particular survivor and many others to launch the plan and enact the goals that were important for stabilization for herself and her children. We know that housing provides a protective factor, is a protective factor for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, protects against vulnerability to future abuse, continued abuse, and it's also been linked to a whole host of positive health outcomes in survivors and children. When you think about all the realms of life that domestic and sexual violence can impact and the negative impacts on overall health and well-being, we've found that in addition to safety, housing stabilization is pretty key in increasing well-being in all these different areas: psychological, physical, social, environmental, and economic for survivors. And now I'll be turning it over to Linda Olsen.
Thanks, Kris. So this is Linda. I'm the Housing Project Director with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I think one of the most exciting moments of my life was when I started thinking about, at the invitation of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and WSCDV, about housing first principles. It's certainly been out there for quite a while. It's done some wonderful things to end chronic homelessness as well as homelessness in veterans. And the principles really recognize, first of all, that homelessness is a housing problem. It's not an issue of an individual person's deficiencies or assorted things. It's housing. Housing is a right. No matter who you are, it should be a right. And people who are homeless or on the verge of homelessness should be stabilized in permanent housing as quickly as possible, then help to sustain that. There shouldn't be prerequisites, the program compliance, the assorted things that for many years we asked people to do in order to be considered ready for housing. And finally, the client's ability to exercise choice promotes success. So when the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation approached the State Coalition in 2009, they were looking at the Housing First data and how great it looked and asked, could this work for DV sexual violence survivors? And some of the things, as we started grappling with this, were the questions about safety. Is it safe? Kind of rushing people into housing. That was almost what it felt like. What about abuser sabotage and all of the things that could go wrong in those efforts to gain housing? The legal issues that took so long to sort through. Just trauma. How could anybody heal and search for housing and do the sort of housing things necessary? We know that housing discrimination is rampant, and even though there might be laws on the books, there are landlords who can afford to be very picky, and they don't necessarily have to disclose why someone is turned down for housing when they've got many people applying for their units. Drug and alcohol use, that can often be an issue for survivors. And then adequate income. As you'll see in a little bit, we don't have the dedicated housing platform that other populations do. We don't have permanent supportive housing that has subsidies. We don't have the housing vouchers, the DASH vouchers for veterans. So adequate income, could survivors ultimately get to that point where they could pay market rate there. So that concern is just in terms of the income, and could survivors get there? So as we worked on this approach with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we definitely started evolving the different concepts that could work to make this a successful, potentially, approach. One of the things that they really emphasized was that we take risks and make mistakes, and you'll hear more about the actual project later on in the presentation. But what evolved from that work was certainly the platform of housing. We have a number of housing options. We don't have just one, but the platform of permanent housing is critical. Our survivor-driven advocacy, survivor-driven trauma-informed mobile advocacy was the service model, the advocacy model that we provided with that. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also provided something that was a little bit out of the ordinary, and that was that half of the grants available for participating agencies had to be used for flexible financial assistance, totally at the direction, at the request, the need of the client, of the survivor. It wasn't to support program costs. It wasn't to be defined by anybody other than somehow contributing to a survivor's stability. And finally, community engagement. Also very important because DV agencies can't do it all. We desperately need the community, and we need to build bridges back into that community for survivors. The permanent housing options for survivors that we've been using and developing is just the concept of prevention or diversion or retention, whatever you want to call it, but a survivor's ability to choose to stay or return to their home. This was a little different for many of us. I was personally surprised, but heard so many times over the years that survivors didn't necessarily want to leave their home or their community. Rapid rehousing, you will hear more about this from Kris in a few minutes, and we really emphasize flexible engagement. Subsidized housing with services available. You know, those Section 8 vouchers are just golden tickets. And then being able to provide services, have the advocacy depth services that can really help people as they choose to retain that housing. And finally, permanent supportive housing for survivors who either had disabilities that were long-term or had children with disabilities. Survivor-driven mobile advocacy, that very first puzzle piece of working flexibly and in the community with survivors. Survivors are leading the process. Advocates focus on the survivor, and not just the domestic or sexual violence, but the entire person, all of the different needs that a survivor might have. So I am going to pause a minute before I pass this over to Kris. Oh, there. Maybe I won't pause just quite yet. Please see this slide and just the things that contribute to survivor-driven mobile advocacy, where the advocate is offering options, considering the unique needs and strengths of each survivor, asking what do you need instead of these are our services. Too many times we have the menu list of what our program provides versus really asking what someone needs and wants. Meeting survivors literally where they are and helping them navigate other support systems. And finally, considering a survivor's culture and community to increase safety and to rebuild connections. And now I'll pause in case there are questions, concerns, before Kris picks up with more detail about mobile advocacy.
Linda, this is Christy. So far, no one has submitted a program content question. So we would like to encourage y'all, if you have questions, please send them in the chat box, and we will be answering those periodically. Thanks.
Okay. While you all think about your questions, I'm going to dig us a little bit more deeply into the mobile services aspect of the survivor-driven package of services that Linda was just addressing. And I love this quote from an advocate who really points out the difference that the services made kind of on an emotional or connection level with survivor or with survivors in general, in addition to how it made services more effective and easier to provide. But it says something different to survivors when we're coming to them. Survivors are often involved in so many systems and have to go to this appointment and fulfill this obligation and this mandate from Child Protective Services or all the many systems they may be involved in. So they're spinning around trying to do everything that they're supposed to be doing to comply with the service providers that they might be navigating around. And when we go to them, when we leave our offices or our shelters and go to them, it communicates something very differently and helps to make a connection that's very unique. Says that something different is happening here, and it's a very positive message. So to put mobile advocacy in context, because to some of us, mobile advocacy is very new, it feels innovative, but it's actually been around for a very long time. It's historically what domestic and sexual violence advocates did before we owned buildings, before we had shelters and offices. Most of our advocacy was very community-based and was happening out there in the world rather than behind closed doors in our offices. So it's in many ways a return to the way that we did things in the early, in the foundation of our movements. It's also a tool that's been broadly used in culturally specific communities and organizations. The Promotora health model in Latino communities, other communities that have also not had buildings or shelters or residential programs to bring people into. So going out into the community has been very widely used in culturally specific communities. And it's also got a really high value in terms of its ability to individualize services for survivors. Instead of being program directed, which can often be what occurs when folks are coming to us and we have, as Linda said, a standard menu of services, we're actually able to very much more individualize the services. And in addition to that, of course, lower barriers by bringing services to folks. Allows us to really consider the environment, the culture, and the trauma impacts that survivors might be experiencing. So mobile services can look like a lot of different things. They can take the form of going together with a survivor to appointments or court hearings and being that steady presence for them. It can involve being very active and engaged in a housing search together with the survivor when housing is something that's being sought. It can also include transporting a participant to help them get something done that's on their goal list. Sometimes it's very helpful when there's immediate need to bridge a language barrier, although we would ideally be working with interpreters and not having advocates do the interpretation. Sometimes in a pinch, it's very important to be able to bridge that language barrier, such as talking with a landlord and being able to have that immediacy of conversation and communication. It also allows for in-person advocacy and intervention when the survivor requests that and really wants the advocate to speak on their behalf or to intervene if they're facing challenges or barriers as they try to get things done. Being right there allows an immediate attention to that kind of advocacy. Mobile services can also include home visits. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more depth in a second. But it can also involve meeting in other places around the community, a coffee shop, going to the workplace because the survivor only has a 30-minute lunch break and that's the only time they might be able to meet with you and can't make it to your office. So that can work well. Libraries, McDonald's are popular because they usually have a children's playroom. So they can be a great place to meet for a survivor. So wherever is safe and convenient and opted for by the survivor can be the site of mobile advocacy. And it really helps provide a calming presence, particularly in intimidating environments, going to court or dealing with Child Protective Services or some of the systems that may be very difficult for survivors to navigate on their own. As I said, a really great way to lower barriers to services. So, transportation barriers, geographic barriers, transportation money, bus tickets, child care, which can sometimes be a difficult thing for survivors. So the advocate taking on the logistics and the burden of that, it can really help services happen more regularly and consistently and more easily for survivors, can bring people into services who otherwise might not be able to show up. In chaotic lives that survivors are often experiencing, appointments and being in a place at an appointed time can be a difficult thing. Getting together all those logistical things that I just talked about may result in some no-shows or just not being able to get there. And when all you need to do is open your door or walk a block to a coffee shop, it might make it a lot easier for for that contact to happen. Many survivors and many of us are intimidated by some of the systems involvement that they have. And they also may be intimidated, afraid, unsure of, or just generally disinclined to use some of the traditional entry points. And I think particularly for folks from cultural communities, especially if there's a language issue, a barrier, they may not call a crisis line or come to a shelter. So it's another way to help people access services. It also allows the advocate to really enter the survivor's world, to be with them when they're out there trying to get things done and dealing with the emotional aspects of things. Helps the advocate get a much better understanding of what the survivor is contending with. And because you're not coming to my office and sitting near my desk where I have my computer, it really puts people on a more equal footing. So if we're looking at trying to partner with survivors as we work together with them, it really helps establish that more equal footing with the advocate. And the survivor has choices about where the work happens and when and what the work looks like. And one of the things that we found in our program, I think advocates who are doing mobile advocacy know this, is that it helps advocates become much more knowledgeable about the system and about partnerships and key people. And advocates become much more effective when they know more about how it works out there in the community versus having contact with folks just through the phone. So home visiting as part of mobile advocacy. It can be part of it. It certainly has to be the survivor's option. Not everyone wants an advocate or a service provider to show up at their front door. So there's a whole lot about providing home visiting that has to be discussed ahead of time and making sure that it's something that the survivor really wants to have happen and isn't just kind of complying with because they think they have to. If when you offer it, you really want to think that through and talk it through with them. Doing some orientation about what a home visit would consist of, making sure that you're informing them that it's not a home inspection, it's not about checking out where they're living and how well they're keeping things clean, that it's just a way for you to continue to have that consistent conversation and connection. It's really important to educate yourself about any cultural considerations that you need to keep in mind as you do home visiting. There might be some situations where a home visit is just not appropriate culturally. And there also might be some considerations around what that might signify to somebody from a culture who feels that a visitor has to be entertained in a certain way. So educating yourself about cultural considerations and also having conversation again with the survivor about that is really important on the front end. Travel light, don't go in big and bulky with lots of briefcases and things that will kind of give you away as a social worker or an advocate, just trying to appear as a visitor at the person's place of living place. Try not to visit at a mealtime. So folks, if they do feel they want to offer you something, it's not a full-out meal unless you're going to help them cook the meal. Maybe that could be part of the visit. but trying not to communicate in any way by the time that you schedule the visit that you're expecting to be fed. Bringing something for children to do, coloring books, crayons, little toys that you can carry pretty portably, because kids are usually pretty interested in the visit as well. Or you can bring a child advocate with you. That's another way that a home visit could be successful for the parent as well as for the kids. Discussing safety and privacy ahead of time, and making sure, since you are assuming the burden of the logistics, that you don't stress yourself out and arrive all out of breath and anxious. Giving yourself time to get lost and making sure that you can arrive calm to the visit. Safety planning is key, and as domestic and sexual violence advocates, we're really good at safety planning. So this is about taking some skills that we already have and applying them to this new kind of service delivery. And that, as I've kind of alluded to a couple of times, it really requires having a lot of conversation and thinking things through before this kind of service delivery starts being implemented. With each survivor, you're going to want to discuss where it's best to have visits, where it's safe and comfortable for you. How would the survivor want to handle it if you're sitting at McDonald's together and someone that the survivor knows comes in? Who do they want you to be? How would they want you to handle that? So talking over those kinds of things is important. What if you have a chance encounter with the person's abuser? Talking that through ahead of time, what the safety planning would be around that. There might be certain circumstances under which, depending on the survivor's living situation, you might want to avoid home visits. It's going to be hard to have safety and privacy, whether that's housemates or extended family, or possibly the abuser still being involved in the survivor's life. All that will have to be factored into whether home visiting is a good idea. And in terms of connection to the program, since you're out and about, when you're doing mobile services and home visiting in specific, make sure someone at your program knows where you are so that you've got that safety factor built in. And our advocates always found that the two most important pieces of equipment were your instincts, your gut feelings about things, and your cell phone, and not just having your cell phone, but making sure you keep it charged. And I think before I turn it over to Linda, I'm going to just check in and see if we have any questions at this point.
Kris, we do have questions.
Okay.
So the first was from Nicole, and I think we may have answered, this was before you really talked about home visits with mobile advocacy. So Nicole, if you have any additional specifics or clarification, please submit that in the chat box. Connie Jo posed, I had a question how you handled phasing clients out of housing first. For example, if you are providing $200 each month to help clients cover the gap in their rent so they don't need to move out of their apartment, how long would you provide that support for? How were you able to get them to a better economic situation where they could cover that $200 gap so they were not relying on your funds forever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, forever is a very long time, and hopefully some of the information that we'll give in the subsequent part of the presentation will help answer that some. But for now, I'll just say that it is important, and we really encourage programs that are working with survivors and doing rental subsidy to be as flexible as possible and not have a rigid timeline, because everybody kind of is on their own schedule. But I think even more importantly is making sure that the survivor gets information and connection to resources that are going to help them, develop their income to the point where they're able to sustain the rent on their own. Sometimes that means debt services that can help them clear arrears or debt that they have that might be dragging them down. Sometimes it might be job training opportunities. So there's a really important service component that I think has to go with rental assistance programs. Not everyone needs those kinds of services because they can kind of get there on their own. and just need the support and the check-in and so forth from an advocate. But sometimes folks really need some help with sitting down and thinking about how they can get to the point where they can fill that gap themselves. So that's got to be part of what the program thinks through and works out individually with each survivor. I don't know if you have something to add, Linda?
Not really. I would certainly say that as we continue on, there will be additional information related to that, but it really entails very connected, engaging advocacy work on the part of the advocate in a way that a survivor can indicate what it is they need. And what we found is that many survivors really indicate that they don't need that much, that when given the opportunity and the hope and the trust and belief in them that an advocate can provide, they are able to get off of any sort of financial assistance much more quickly than we might think they can.
Great, thanks, Linda. So we've had a few other questions. If y'all want to take a few more, and then we can move on. And I do want to say we've had a lot of folks asking about if we have questions post-webinar. So there, you can certainly submit those on the safehousingpartnership.org website, and that information will also be in the slides, but just to kind of throw that out there to everyone. Another question we had for Kris and Linda: some programs don't transport due to liability. Do you have any suggestions?
I can take that one. Right now,
Okay.
We've been certainly finding that out with many of our project partners. And what they've done is encouraged staff, for one thing, to certainly look at their own insurance policies and have the maximum liability limit. They're also looking at what it would cost to help staff do that in their own vehicles. They're also looking at agency liability policies. Some organizations purchase their own vehicles and have them available so that they cover all of the costs. But there are a wide variety of different ways in order to address that. Do you have any more suggestions, Kris?
No, I think that's great, and I think the other possibility is if you live in a community that has public transportation, then helping people, connect to that and learn how to use that system, and sometimes, going together on public transportation to get places. So it really depends on the community, what variety of responses that programs are developing for that.
Absolutely. We've got several project partners where advocates don't have cars because it is that urban setting and it's just as easy for them to take public transportation. So we certainly hear how they meet people different places or accompany them on public transportation.
Great. Also, what was the consideration for advocate safety in the mobile program?
Well, we could do a whole webinar on safety planning, but there actually is going to be a toolkit available for that. There's also tools available through the Washington State Coalition website. Safety planning protocols for home visiting and mobile advocacy. There's a lot of information out there about that. So I just did a very brief slide on that today. But basically the bottom line is safety planning for the survivor equals safety planning for the advocate. So, thinking about the fact that it's likely to be the survivor who's more at risk for something to happen if, safety planning isn't part of what you're considering. But it keeps the advocate safe as well if you're safety planning for that survivor. So all those tips that I gave on a couple of the slides, there's a whole lot more to be said about all of those things, but that's definitely something that advocates need to be prepared for, and there needs to be agency kind of policy and protocol around what that safety planning looks like. But it's really a key part of doing these services. I will say that we had nothing bad happen in the years that we were doing mobile advocacy before I left the program that I left about a year and a half ago. In fact, for about 20 years using that model. So I think the instincts of the advocate, the planning ahead of time, and the agency backing it with a protocol and some expectations about the advocate checking in and making sure that there's like a backup plan for that advocate when they're out there in the field.
Great. Thanks, Kris. And we have a few more questions, but I think we'll hold and let y'all continue on, and we'll hopefully have time to answer those.
Great. Okay. So I will turn it over to Linda now.
All right. Yep. So trauma-informed approach. And I think as we talk about survivor-driven, survivor choices, Jill Davies, victim-defined, the work that really has survivors' needs at the focus of what we do, including the mobile advocacy part, that shapes into a trauma-informed approach. It starts out with the relationship with the provider, a relationship with that advocate, being aware of the safety concerns of the survivor, both physical as well as emotional, being aware of the potential triggers that a survivor might experience. Again, not just those physical triggers, but also the emotional triggers that can certainly impact and often freeze somebody's responses or develop into many different symptoms or issues that can be a little hard to get past if you're not familiar with that. The most important thing is just rebuilding the control for that survivor. We know that one of the things related to safety and trauma is that they've lost control over aspects of their life. Someone else has taken that from them, and in order to regain that sense of hope and dignity and self-confidence, being able to restore the control, looking at choices, and power sharing, so that it isn't ever a matter of an advocate telling a survivor what they should do. Always offer options, offer different consequences or outcomes that might be ahead of some of those options, but realize that the advocate's not the one in charge of that person's life. So the power sharing, the choice that goes with it, and really looking at somebody's strengths so that the work that you're doing builds on strengths and not looks at the weaknesses that you think someone might need to overcome, but what are the strengths that can help do that. And as we work with this trauma-informed approach and just the information we know now about brain development and how can we better work with survivors, we are so aware that it's vital that the entire agency have a culture that's trauma-informed, that they have a culture that is really aware of the fact that many of the advocates working in the agency have also been survivors of domestic or sexual violence. So there's the potential for triggers. There's the potential to get overwhelmed and burned out. And so many basically think that they need to do everything for everybody. And when you're not working out of a facility where you've got a defined number of beds or units, when you're more mobile, when you're working with people outside of those facilities and in the community, it is even easier to start taking on more than someone can handle. So it's important for the agency to be aware of that, supportive of that, and really respond to that in a way that people don't get burned out. Because advocates that aren't healthy, aren't in-tuned, are tired, burned out, frustrated, are not going to provide great services, as we know they can. I always say that I think advocates walk on water, and they certainly do. So the next puzzle piece, the next component, is the flexible financial assistance. And when we receive this and have been passing it through to agencies, it is just totally unrestricted. And what Gates said was that it should support survivors to become stably housed. But we found out that in terms of that stable housing, it wasn't just about housing-related things, utilities. the sorts of things that go with that, but it also included different things that supported employment, the safety, maybe security locks, other critical needs. The level of need and the amount of flexible financial assistance was determined in full partnership with the survivor. And the additional assistance that could be provided was based on the changing needs of the survivor. No requirements were issued to meet goals or participate in services. There weren't the compliance things that so many people often see in other forms of housing. The flexible financial assistance also could be used. These are some examples. I don't see any slides right now on my screen, so I'm hoping that at this point you've got the flexible financial assistance screen that shows the circles of different examples that would say rent, deposit, and utilities, the things that we would expect. Kris mentioned debt reduction. We found that has been huge just in order to get people into housing. Transportation. We had folks that were even able to purchase cheap used cars, tires for cars, driver's licenses. We were able to help with car insurance, so there were a wide variety of things besides the usual bus tickets that were helpful in terms of transportation. School or work needs, employment certification, different programs like cosmetology classes. Back rent was important. Children. You know, this was one of the things that we were so, again, delighted with and astounded by, that the children were kind of key for that survivor, and survivors often would forego a utility payment or other things in order to do that birthday party for their child, or in order to somehow get athletic equipment, whatever they could do to normalize life for a child. That's what people would really embrace doing. So while it might feel like it's a stretch to think of that as toward housing stability, what we heard from survivors was knowing that their children were happy and thriving and doing well, made it possible for them to settle down and create that environment that was stable. They could go to work and feel confident that all was well with their child. So, of course, there are also many other things, but the next component, in addition to the flexible financial assistance, is just the community engagement component. Community engagement started out pretty much simply with the idea that we needed to connect with landlords. And what we found out with the organizations is that it was vital to work in and engage with the community to build connections that would support survivors' safety, independence, and the housing stability. So that went beyond landlords and home managements and certainly the housing homeless programs, but that really expanded to all of the community resources, the neighborhood groups, the Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCAs, and just helping people get connected with the services that might be involved in their community. That was so important in terms of stabilizing and supporting the entire family. We should be on the housing advocacy, a critical component slide right now. I still can't see the slide, so I'm hoping you all can. And the housing advocacy was that core of how we begin doing this work, how we begin with Housing First, was really training advocates in a way that they could adequately support a survivor in identifying housing, in removing the barriers for housing, and just to identify the spectrum of housing options, because as we all know, there are survivors that might need a very, very little bit of money, a very little bit of advocacy, and they're fine. And the folks that often come into our emergency shelters and transitional housing programs actually need a lot more. So how do you identify the best housing option for that survivor in conjunction with what they're identifying that they want and need? Part of this is certainly the providing direct support, accompanying survivors to their housing appointments. We learned how to negotiate lease agreements, and certainly to act as liaisons between survivors and landlords. One of the things that many of our advocates found out is that they could prevent homelessness simply by being an advocate to a landlord or to a housing authority and be able to preserve the housing without any sort of financial payment. So the combination of both was always useful, and it was a fantastic way that survivors could be supported. The next slide is community engagement. And community engagement is the development of the strong relationships with the housing authorities and landlords. We've talked about that a lot, and cultivating relationships with community members, businesses, and service providers. A part of that we found particularly exciting is just it goes hand in hand with our education to the community about domestic and sexual violence. And we're able to raise awareness of survivor needs. So we're doing two things at once. We're not only reminding people that survivors are there in their community, they're living and working among them, often they're not aware that survivors are there. They don't always disclose. So just being able to alert community members that survivors are here, they can be helpful, they can be supportive in a wide variety of different ways. So the next slide is the restoring connection. Community is vital for this. I don't know if I've skipped slides or if that's what you're seeing, but the restoration of social network. I see Rebecca Ambrose in the chat box talking about assessing their social capital and resources and safety. And that's exactly what needs to happen, again, in terms of addressing trauma symptoms and the impacts of trauma, is that social network. That is often what makes the difference between being poor and housed and being poor and homeless, is that social connection, social network. Healing from trauma, having community around you, connection. We've heard a lot lately about connection, not just to community members and resources, but to one another, just to a vibrant neighborhood. And finally, safety. Community is vital for safety. And what we've found out, again, with that is that when a survivor has fully integrated into their community, whether it's their original community or new community of choice, they talk about neighbors having their back. They talk about knowing what the resources are around them. They talk about feeling really safe in their particular community. So safety is just another direct outcome for that connection that we really hope survivors can do with the help of a great advocate. So I'm going to pause and turn this back over to Kris for rapid rehousing after a pause.
So we have had some really great questions, and I don't know that time is going to permit for all of them now, but to let you know, we will be following up if we don't get to your question today. But there's been, I just want to go back, there's, when we were talking about mobile advocacy, there was quite a bit of conversation around the use of a cab or Uber, and I know someone asked about if you could post your organizational policy on Uber or Lyft. So if y'all have that information and want to send it to us or even post it in the chat box, we can send it post-webinar for everybody to look at if they're interested in seeing it. So several questions on flex funding, y'all. One, where do you get the funds for flexible financial assistance?
Okay, well, in our particular case, we started with Gates Foundation funds, a great foundation, and their goal was to really emphasize how useful flexible financial assistance was so that more organizations would be able to receive that through other foundations. We have a number of organizations now that are using this as part of their appeal to donors, and they've actually been able to increase donations for people who are contributing to the idea that a survivor and their family might benefit from flexible financial assistance. There was one organization that actually planned a whole luncheon, donor luncheon, around the concept of flexible financial assistance, and that was the theme. We're also really working at trying to make public funds a little bit more flexible, and we've seen that to a degree with VOCA. There's certainly some flexibility in some of the new rounds of VOCA spending. We've also been able to see that at least locally with our jurisdictions here in Washington State. Both the City of Seattle and King County have brought up flexible financial assistance programs, not as flexible as Gates, but definitely providing a lot more flexibility. So both with the education for public funders, private funders, and community efforts, the organization's efforts to work with their community to highlight the benefits of having this sort of pot of money available, not just for that emergency, but for the long-term support that a survivor might need and just needs a kickstart toward that.
Yeah, and I will just echo that last piece that you mentioned about public funding, Linda. In our community, I think it really came down to how we talked about the value and the worth of that flex funding. And we were able to we just decided to start putting that line in our budgets that we were submitting for some of our local public funding contracts as an essential part of delivering the services. So our contracts with the police, with the Department of Probation and Parole, where we provided advocates to work with victims that they were working with the perpetrators of, we just wrote that in as a necessary expense to put somebody in a motel or to buy some food or whatever the situation might require. So some of it was coming around to figuring out how to message that and talk about it as just a vital part of providing services and not an add-on.
Great. And then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, these slides seem to have a life of their own.
I didn't know if y'all were doing that or, you know, it goes to the machine. That's all I'm saying, y'all.
I guess so.
One more, as we're trying to figure out what's on the slides, one more quick follow-up from Amanda. How do you determine the total dollars for flexible funding per month?
Well, I think you start with what you have, and then you try to build on that, because I think that you don't have much difficulty in spending that money when you're able to say yes to more requests because your pot has gotten a little bit deeper. Then that's great. And I think it does depend on the kinds of uses that you're able to put it to. So if you're doing rent assistance and kind of big ticket items, car repair, those kinds of things, it's going to go more quickly than if you're helping somebody with application fees and that kind of thing. So I think it's about looking at what you can start with and figuring out how you can pace yourself. That's one of the things our organization used to do, is try to kind of divide up the money that we had over a period of time so that we didn't have a whole lot for 1 month and then nothing the next month. So there's a lot. Those are good thoughts, though. It's really important to be thinking about how you would budget that and how you would distribute it. So a lot of it is about piloting it and experimenting with it and see what kinds of requests you're getting and what kind of funds you might need to be able to meet more of those requests and as you build the pot.
Great. Yeah, this is Linda.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Linda.
Saying a little bit more about that, what many of our organizations did was just start with, what is it you really need right now?
So rapid rehousing, we want to talk a little bit more about that particular model. And first, to make sure everybody has kind of a common understanding of what we mean when we say rapid rehousing, I've got this definition put up by the National Alliance to End Homelessness, which has really put out a lot of great material and guidance around rapid rehousing for mainstream providers. But it's really about trying to either avoid homelessness or help people exit homelessness very quickly and return to permanent housing so that the homelessness episode is very short or in some cases might be diverted altogether. It's about offering, according to Housing First principles, assistance without any kind of preconditions. So not expecting somebody to be employed first and then they can enroll in the program or any of those other barriers to services that we talked about earlier. And it's also about really tailoring the resources and the services to the unique needs of that household. So those are some of the basics about rapid rehousing. Now, the National Alliance to End Homelessness has put out some great descriptions of what the components of rapid rehousing are, and they're called the core components. They're pretty commonly accepted in the homeless housing world, and we're looking at them, of course, in the domestic and sexual violence world as well. The core components, as defined by the National Alliance to End Homelessness, are three. The first is housing identification, and this is the stage where you're really looking to help people lease up. And this is the population of survivors that actually needs new housing rather than can be supported in staying in the housing that they're in currently or returning to that. So housing identification involves working with landlords to try to get a bank of landlords that know your program and work with you, and also which landlords sometimes to avoid because they're predatory. But you're also in this stage looking at what are the barriers this household is going to face to being able to get housing, and to help them by navigating or advocating around those barriers to secure a unit. The second component is the financial assistance part. So it's rent and move-in fees primarily in this mainstream rapid rehousing model, less flexible than the flexible funds we've been talking about because it's pretty geared towards rent and the actual cost of sustaining the apartment and as traditionally defined. So you're supporting their quick move out of homelessness by providing rental subsidy. According to the National Alliance, that's typically 6 months or less of financial subsidy. And then the third component is the case management and supportive services that go along with that family's unique needs that can help them support, stay in the housing once they have obtained it. So in terms of rapid rehousing, I think I just kind of went ahead of myself and addressed this. Some survivors, you know, what we need is that whole continuum of housing options for survivors because their needs really are on that continuum as well. So some survivors still definitely need or want confidentially located shelter. Some are going to face really high barriers to having a lease in their own name, and they're going to need longer-term subsidy and perhaps even a master leasing kind of situation. Others want to return to the housing they left or remain in it once that can be made safe. But there is a component of the survivor population we have found through experience that really just want to get into new housing in a neighborhood setting as soon as possible so that they can restabilize themselves and their kids. So for that section of subsection of the survivor population, rapid rehousing may be a very good fit. So we're going to take the core components as the National Alliance has defined them and look at some of the survivor-specific considerations in each one of those core components. So when we look at housing identification, that first component, some of the considerations are that when domestic or sexual violence survivors seek housing, landlords may see trouble. They may anticipate police presence, noise, disruption, damage to the unit, and it may be a difficult sell. and because they are in business and they want to keep their units intact and so forth. So that's one of the survivor-specific considerations that might require our attention as advocates. Survivors, as probably everyone on the call knows, may have really poor housing history, and they may have really bad credit. We know that financial abuse is a huge part of domestic and sexual violence and can be a very difficult piece of helping to identify housing in that front end. With bad history and bad credit and perhaps no employment, it's, again, a very difficult sell with a landlord. Survivors may have pets that they can't leave behind. We know how critical the pets are to the family's emotional well-being, but we also know how worried survivors are about what might happen to the pet if the pet is left behind. So with landlords getting, as Linda was saying earlier, able to be pickier and pickier about who they hire, or who they bring in and consider as tenants, people with pets have, a barrier to face around that prospect. Housing in high crime areas, which is where a lot of affordable housing is, may be a trauma trigger for survivors who are dealing with those trauma impacts and their children as well. We also have to consider housing location not just based on where the program has a unit available, but on whether that is a good or bad idea based on safety considerations. So with the second part, the second core component, financial assistance, some of the survivor-specific considerations, we already mentioned this, the financial abuse often has resulted in terrific debt and arrears. Survivors have had typically no control over finances, so there's a financial record that comes with them that can be a big barrier. They're also typically often dislocated from their social supports and resources, sometimes because they've had to flee to a new geographic area, many times because the abuse made it very difficult for them to keep those connections. Employment sabotage, so probably a very spotty employment record. And the complex aftermath of systems involvement means that it might be very difficult for them to pursue an income development plan right away or do a job search right away because they have to show up at court or they have to be at a CPS appointment and that kind of thing. And the trauma impacts themselves may make it very hard for folks to put themselves out there and present in job interviews and so forth without a lot of fear and trepidation. So with the services and support component, some of the survivor-specific considerations are those trauma-specific supports that survivors are going to need, and children as well. There might be civil or immigration legal issues that come with the survivor and are very much part of a long period of time during and after being in an abusive relationship. Social supports have been cut off. That's got to be a really key part of what kinds of supportive services are provided, as Linda was talking about earlier, that connection to community and resources and just plain old emotional support and comfort are really important. Criminal history, dependency, chemical dependency may come with survivors, and there also may be an abuser still in the picture. So the services around how to keep somebody safe as they begin living out in the community and in a new housing situation have to be very much attended to in the services section of the rapid rehousing model. So there are a whole lot of modifications that we would recommend for providers who are using rapid rehousing with survivors, and here are just some of them. We know how important, and if you haven't heard us drumming on this a lot, we'll drum on it again now, survivor-led safety planning is so key, and it starts with thinking about the housing location and being very tuned into that rather than what's convenient for the program. The flexible length of rental subsidy, which we've already mentioned, that typically less than 6 months, a piece that we saw in the core components slide, often has to be looked at and extended, and it's not so neat as something that's going to be resolved within 6 months or less. So the rental subsidy may need to be longer than that. Some communities are enacting rapid rehousing programs where the rental subsidy is 1 to 3 months, and I don't think that's realistic for a lot of households, and certainly isn't for a lot of survivor households. Informed consent around data storage and data sharing, and lots of it. That it could be another whole webinar around databases and releases of information and so forth, but that's definitely a consideration that programs will need to explore as they work with the homeless housing system particularly. Preparing survivors how to talk about the impact of the domestic or sexual violence on their credit and on their housing history without being a trauma trigger, so that it doesn't always require an advocate to be sitting there with them, although that may be the first step, so that survivors feel empowered to be able to embrace what's occurred to them and be able to talk about it in a way that helps people open themselves to considering them for employment or for rent or for tenancy. Thinking about how if abusers might be stalking or a survivor might be found in the new housing that you've just helped them lease up, you might need to have the provision for another housing placement. So it may not just be a one and done kind of situation, having that backup in the back of your mind, knowing that that could be a process that has to start all over again. Trauma-informed survivor-driven services, of course, training for all staff and in your partnership, and looking at what partnerships you may have and what partnerships you may need. And then, if you're a domestic or sexual violence provider, really working with homeless housing providers to know more about the federal, state, and local laws that protect survivors. What are the housing protections that your community in particular may have enacted, or your state, as well as the federal laws that provide housing protections for survivors. And to bone up on that ourselves as we move into the housing realm more as domestic and sexual violence providers. And before I turn it back over to Linda or open it up to questions, I wanted to make sure to mention these considerations in working with cultural communities as you work with survivors to help them look at their housing options. Ties to their cultural community may be a real challenge to housing location, and it sometimes causes us to have to really look at how we define safety versus how the survivor defines safety, and going with the survivor's definition of safety. It may be so much more important for that survivor to be living close to a support system or a cultural community rather than, putting geographic distance between themselves and the abuser. So working with survivors to help them look at how they can use those ties and that cultural community as part of their support system rather than a community that they're just going to be ripped away from. Affordable housing is often not available in some of the historic or traditional neighborhoods for cultural communities because of gentrification. So that's a real challenge that we don't necessarily have an answer for. But I know that in Portland, Northeast Portland, which is a historically Black community, is now become very outpriced for a lot of African-American community members. And so that is a real dilemma that your program may have to be working with survivors around and grappling with yourselves. And really looking at how relocation sometimes is just going to further traumatize people. We think about safety sometimes in terms of get away, and sometimes we have to really turn that on its head a little bit and again, look at what's going to help somebody, the survivor, meet their own definition of safety. Okay, I'm going to pause here And I'm doing a time check, and Christy, I'm thinking that we might want to move ahead with the next section and try to have some time for questions at the end, because Linda's got a piece to get into now. Does that work for everyone?
No, certainly that works, and we've had a lot of interaction among folks sharing resources on the chat. So just to let you know, we will be sure any of the resources that have been offered to get that out to everybody if you're interested. So please go ahead, Kris.
Great. So go ahead, Linda, and I'll move your slides for you if you want to signal me if it's not working for you, Linda. The one that's up right now is...
I think it's all taken care of, and I'll keep my fingers crossed. And the next little piece is just basically the evidence. I'm not going to spend much time on this. There will be a few highlights, but just so that you can see the evidence, you can certainly have these slides, as well as be aware of where our evaluation material is. But in terms of that pilot project that I referenced, that was Washington statewide, and we started with 4 agencies. And they were so successful in their initial efforts that among these 4 agencies, there were 2 medium-sized communities, one in a very, very rural setting and one in an urban setting. They were able to identify and help survivors settle in or access new housing, 93% of the survivors that were coming to them for this project. And based on that, the Gates Foundation refunded another group of 9 agencies, so that was really exciting. And this was the group that we really focused on diversity in particular. We had 3 tribal programs. We had 3 programs out on the peninsula, very rural programs, a program that was in eastern Washington focused on migrant farm workers, as well as several urban programs. But it mostly became more of an urban, rural sort of approach to the work that we were doing. We had it evaluated. The Gates Foundation really upped their investment in evaluation. So we had Dr. Leon Guy Memblini from the University of Washington do that. And we had 681 survivors over the 3 years entering the different agencies. I just want to say, in terms of looking at the evaluation results, this is not a longitudinal study where we are tracking every one of those 681 people. It's more of a sample of the survivors who are willing to participate and would actually respond to advocates for that follow-up. So when we think about the data that we're providing, there were 438 survivor households over those 3 years that were able to be reached for the final follow-up interview. And so that 438, that could have been someone who was participating from the beginning and all 3 years, or it could have been someone who had just been entered in the last quarter for 3 months. So for more details about that, I've got the web page for you all to go to if you really want to dig in and read more of that. One of the surprising things that we found was that half of this population wanted to stay in their own homes or return to their homes. If you look at 43% who were renting, and then 7% who own their home, and this is of the 681 people who started out with the programs. Of the ones that we were able to locate and would actually participate in a final interview, and that's 438, 88% were in housing. 7% of the total had obtained housing but lost it. We understand all of the reasons why they lost that housing, because they stayed in touch and we were able to reach them and have all of that wonderful information. This can be a little misleading, and people have trouble sometimes with this slide, but when we look at the 438 folks, and they're coming in at different times throughout those 3 years, 235 people were there for 6 months, and 93% of those people who had the continuous 6 months worth of housing over those 3 years were still in housing. Of that, 173, 91% were able to retain their housing over 12 months. And then finally narrowing down a bit more for folks who were actually housed for 18 months. And of the 121 that fell into that category, 96% retained housing. So for me, the takeaway is for those who were actively involved with their advocates, they were the ones who were available for follow-up interviews. They were the ones most likely still working with their advocates. It really emphasizes the importance of the connection and the advocacy. I will keep on moving. This is the demographics. 33%, 35% were Native American, Alaska Native. Actually, 33 were in those different programs. And the remaining 2 here were folks who were in other programs over on the coast. Urban communities, for those of you who are interested in this, and Kris has already mentioned how unsafe housing can be really challenging and that it's hard for survivors to make a decision between unsafe housing or being homeless. I have also gotten pushback from folks who listen to this and say, but you know what, those unsafe communities are still our communities, and if we decide to live there, that is just something that is important to us in terms of connection. 67% of those survivors lived in rural communities, and where we found the biggest challenge there was that there was a lack of housing altogether. So for these communities in particular, many of the ways flexible financial assistance used was to help landlords bring substandard housing up to standard comfortable codes. They might rip out moldy carpet or reinforce windows. Basically, if the survivor said, this is where I want to continue to live, or this is where I can live, want to live, choose to live, can you help us as landlord and survivor make this something that's livable? So our key findings, and this came from some amazing data information with our interviews with survivors and advocates, as well as with focus groups from survivors and advocates. And I just can't emphasize enough the survivor-driven advocacy, because survivors said, you know, that the money was great, but what made the difference was the advocate. We couldn't have done it without the advocate's support. We found out from them that the housing stability made a big difference in terms of their independence, safety, as well as their health and well-being. And one of the questions that we asked on survivor surveys, anonymous surveys that we left with different agencies for survivors to complete, was that their dignity was restored and they felt more valuable. We know that it contributes oh dear, here we go again. Okay, well, I'm just going to move ahead to the demonstration project regions because that's right where we are right now, and I know that we want to keep 10 minutes for more questions at least. So when I think of all of the great feedback that we got, our demonstration project regions that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came back and said, the pilot was great. The 5 years of work here was spectacular. We will continue to fund another iteration of this for 5 years. So we've got demonstration project going on now. We've got a region in King County, Seattle-King County of 4 organizations. And then on the east side, primarily rural, we've got South Central region, and there's a lot of migrant farm workers as well as Native people who are part of these particular organizations. So what we're trying to do, yep, there it went again. So I hope I'm on the last slide, which, or at least the last slide for me, which speaks to what we're trying to do with the Innovation for Long-Term Systemic Change is certainly to show that the work that we do, our advocacy work as a whole, leads to improved health and well-being for survivors. And it's important to note that we don't have, as one of these goals, ending homelessness, but our goal is just recognizing that housing stability and our advocacy is a contributing factor to improved health and well-being for survivors. We're working on increasing the level of evidence, so currently have a longitudinal research project going on that is being conducted by Dr. Kris at Michigan State University, and it's underway with a couple of agencies in each of those regions. And as we increase the level of evidence, we hope to be able to encourage both public and private funders to embrace not only the flexible financial assistance idea, but to really recognize the work that advocates do. And then finally, we're working with housing systems in a way that can better meet the needs of survivors. So those are the longer-term goals of what we're trying to do, and we've got funding from the Gates Foundation and from HHS that is contributing to this 5-year, $2 million longitudinal study. So I'd be happy to answer questions, probably offline if any one of you are interested, and I will take a breath and turn it back over to Kris or Christy in whatever you want to do next.
Yes, let me just take a moment to say before we use our last few precious minutes for a couple more questions that NASH does provide training and technical assistance in some of the areas that you see listed on the slide, or hopefully most of you can see the slide. So coordinated entry, building collaborative relationships, trauma-informed practice, rapid rehousing, housing first, as in today's webinar, and then the federal, state, and local housing protections. So you can certainly request technical assistance through that Safe Housing Partnerships website we looked at earlier. You can also contact NASH directly, and we can connect you with the right technical assistance partner that we have as part of our consortium work. So questions, we've got about, 6 minutes, 5 minutes, because 1 minute for wrap up.
So we have had really great questions and probably could use another 45 minutes just to do that. So I'm going to try to take the highlights. And again, I just want to remind everyone that we'll go through afterwards with the chat box. We're keeping up with the questions and trying to make sure we have relevant information out to everyone. So if we don't answer your question specifically now, we will follow up. So, Kris and Linda, we've had a couple of questions for some folks around housing stability and what happens when you're helping to get housing for clients and then they lose their housing. They've either lost housing or about to lose housing. So, what are some strategies for helping people maintain housing stability, or do you have recommendations for if you've helped someone get into housing and then they may be on the verge of losing it again?
I can say a little bit. I know, Kris, you probably can too, but we've had organizations participating that were aware that somebody was about to lose housing, and what they would do was very carefully avoid the eviction notice. There was one family in particular, the survivor had a major relapse. There were threats that she would lose her kids. So the agency was able to support her in accessing the services that she would need and to make sure the kids were placed in families ahead of any sort of official moves, and so that there was the certain avoidance of the eviction, which helped. There's also been just the conversations related to, all right, that didn't work, we're avoiding eviction procedures, so what can we do next to help you? And then, of course, when folks are evicted, the idea is that people aren't necessarily, that the door isn't shut, there's the thoughtful conversation, and the advocacy to see what bridges can be repaired and to see if that eviction can be avoided. More, Kris?
Yeah, and I think that you can sometimes, if it's housing authority, housing, you can do appeals. It's where advocacy really comes into play, and it does have to be a very tailored, individualized response based on what kind of housing the person is in, how much notice you have that things aren't working. If the communication and the relationship between the household and the advocate is really well established, then sometimes you get a hint ahead of time that things might not be working as solidly as you might have thought they were. And so the earlier you can intervene, the better. So that communication piece and the relationship piece is really key, on top of all the tricks that we might come up with based on the system and our community. Sometimes landlords can be appealed to, but yeah, I think avoiding getting an eviction on somebody's record is really important whenever that can be part of your advocacy work.
Great, thanks, y'all. Let's see. There was several questions around survivor privacy. In particular, any suggestions for survivor privacy issues when applying for housing resources, i.e. public housing authorities, coordinated entry, etc. And then also to go along with that, folks were wondering about VAWA protections. And I know you talked about this a little bit, VAWA protections with tenants with bad credit, etc. So I know that's kind of could be a very long, engaged answer, but any thoughts off the top of your head?
Well, I actually see one person in the chat box who, thank you, Jessica, who said, make friendly with your local legal aid organization. So if you do have legal aid services in your community or in a neighboring community, they're often very up on all the housing protections that can be brought to bear in these kinds of situations. As far as the confidentiality and protections when working, and privacy protections when working with the homeless housing field, again, that's another whole webinar. And I think, Christy, you could answer that question. But we're really advocating for homeless housing systems to, basically follow the HUD requirements that have been phased in around coordinated entry that require safety planning with survivors. We're really advocating for an opt-in process as far as data entry goes, so that survivors get a chance to consider whether they want their data entered into a database. So yeah, I'm saying a lot of words in a very short period of time, and there's a lot of meat behind these concepts that we can't do justice to in the next 30 seconds. But there's definitely information available, and you can also make a technical assistance request around that.
Absolutely. And then just quickly, because I know we're very limited on time, but Jessica has offered up several resources, so I kind of want to throw her question out there since she's helping us a little bit on some resources. So, Linda, when you were talking about the DV Housing First program, Jessica said these are fantastic results. Did you combine the Gates Foundation money with COC or ESG funding? And is Gates expanding the project? And will there be an RFP out for other programs?
Okay, Gates is not expanding the project, at least not that we know of, but they can be unpredictable. I think they feel like they've made their contribution to change the world as far as DV and housing homeless issues. And the other question was, did we use it with other funding? And certainly organizations did. The whole idea of the different platforms, so if there was ESG money that could do the rapid rehousing part, there was certainly the application of flexible financial assistance. The same thing with other pots of COC money, as long as it was leveraged towards permanent housing. So rapid rehousing always had some sort of COC money in it, or whether it was the DV organization itself or whether it was another organization, housing homeless organization, that the agency, DV SA agency, was working with. So we really promoted leveraging. It was the smaller communities that didn't always have these resources that tended to invest more of their flexible financial assistance into rental assistance and similar sorts of programs.
Great.
Thank you, Linda.
Chris, I was going to say,
I think we need to
bring
wrap
us
up.
on home, Chris. Bring us on home.
Okay. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining today's session. I think we could have taken a 3-hour block. Please be sure to respond to our brief survey upon logging out, which you'll be getting. And if you're interested in technical assistance or training in any of the topics or issues we discussed today, you have the opportunity to request it directly through completing that survey. We can also send anyone who's interested a certificate of completion for attending this webinar. So if you are interested, please note my email address, which is on this final slide, and let me know you'd like one sent to you, and I'll make those arrangements. Please also feel free to contact any of the participants in the chat box that you met today for resource sharing and support. And just as a reminder, we will be sending out the PowerPoint slides at the end of this session. So thank you again. Thank you, Linda, Christy, Justine, everyone involved in pulling this off today. And thank you so much for attending.